demands, which we get from the we talked about this specifically in the context of the Genocide Convention when we read Samantha Powers. And the argument is that sometimes this may not be in the interest of importantly not in the interest of the United States, and we don't want to actually stop genocide, or we don't want to intervene in countries. We talked specifically about the case, remember Kissinger in Chile and in Argentina. Whether this was genocide or not, we could argue, but we know from reading this novel that horrible things happened in Argentina, and it was supported by our government. Horrible things happened in Guatemala. Even more horrible things happened, supported by our government. Much of this opposed by its citizenry. The debate about whether the country should do something, whether this is in fact in its interest, whether you can act against immediate interest for long-term interest, is a debate that's still going on. I didn't answer this for you, but what I did suggest is that these covenants produce a platform in which the demand can be made on the state, more or less successfully, and debated by intelligent people. I mean, Henry Kissinger's no idiot when he said it's better to let some of these bad things happen if this keeps the world free from nuclear war. So, stupid arguments. There's still arguments that are still going on today. So I just suggested to you that these covenants produce certain norms. Whether they're actually enforced is something that depends on the political process of which all of us are a part. And I just reminded you of the most famous of these, the Universal Declaration that we talked about in some detail, which is sort of the basis of, in some sense, of all the subsequent protocols and covenants and so forth. I think this is the 8th point. This is the 8th point. We talked in some issue periodically about civil rights, the marriage issue of civil rights, the miscegenation issue of civil rights. And a number of other times we talked about civil rights. National laws and norms are crucial in the exercise of human rights. We started reading Hannah Arendt, who argued that bare life, just being human outside of a system of life, of norms and laws, doesn't count for very much. It's therefore crucial that all humans are regarded as under the protection of law that treats everyone equally. We talk about this when we talk about immigration. The song of the deportees is just a large category of deportees who don't belong here, who have no particular, or these people now in these internment, these camps that the immigration authorities put up, are people who live in a legal limbo. Stateless people are in that context. Refugees are in this context. The biggest single group of stateless people in the world right now are the Palestinians, but there are others. And these are people whose civil rights don't exist because they don't live under a civitas, a political society. And in other places, and this is a map of refugees. All these refugees live in places where they have no status, essentially. So the world is full of people who don't exist in these contexts, whose rights, the immigrants, which we talked about, is another category. So civil and political, civil rights within a culture are crucial for human rights to be enforced. Enough. The United Nations estimates 16 million refugees who either are stateless or not under the protection of the state. I show you this picture of the wall in Israel, just to point this out, and the wall in the U.S.-Mexican border. So these are I mean, they're politically obviously different. I'm not trying to say these are absolutely analogous, but I'm trying to say that people who come into this country undocumented are in the position of kind of a legal limbo of bare life, like refugees and stateless people. So, next to last question. This is on your. I put some of this on your study question, and it's something I've been trying to talk about all through the course, and many of our lectures have talked about as well. And this is the idea that there's such a thing as human rights culture, and that it's sort of thickened in the last half century, and even more in the last 20 years. So what I mean by that is that when we talk about human rights, and we think what human rights means, I wanted you to suggest to you, I don't mean just laws about human rights, international covenants about human rights, even protest movements about human rights. I mean this much broader international civil society and national civil society, people engage in these issues. So I mean the development of NGOs, of IGOs, intergovernmental organization, all sorts of other bodies that provide a global as well as a national structure for conversation and actions. So human rights have been globalized and they've been nationalized. And they deal with issues like housing, prisons, immigration, right to marry, women's rights, all of which we've talked about. We didn't talk about indigenous people's rights. I did when I did the course before. But it's another one of these issues in which folks are mobilized at various different levels to engage and argue for these rights, which have been articulated in international covenants, but to make them real, to make them matter, to do something about them involves a broader engagement. And so we read books like Jerry Labor's book to show how does this woman get engaged in this culture. We had this talk last week about how Amnesty International grew from this kind of organization for individual prisoners with Peter Benison in the 1960s, dealing with particular prisoners of conscience, to using the very same techniques of letter writing and exposure to deal with removing people from their illegitimately moving from their housing. That was a rather remarkable lecture. He did, by the way, say again that he was interested in people being interns with him, so you guys should take him up on it. I think you have many of you asked for his email, and those you did not, can send it to you if you asked me for it. But I thought that was a sort of remarkable story, right, about how we come to be engaged with housing problems in Nigeria, like we did about people being prisoners of conscience. We start writing letters. We start knowing about it. We start getting engaged in this. And this happens all over the world. As he pointed out, more people per capita in Norway than anywhere else. But more people per capita everywhere than 50 years ago, where it was close to zero. Or not zero, but very little. So that's what I mean by this sort of examples of, and I gave you some examples. We talked about Human Rights Watch. We didn't even scratch the surface of even major humanitarian organizations like Oxfam or Save the Children. We could have done many thousands, tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands all over the world with people who are engaged in these sorts of issues. So that was the cultural claim. So my last point of what I thought you did learn is that I've tried to suggest that human rights have become a common language of ethical and political engagement. It's, broadly speaking, it's talk about what's decent and dignified in our treatment of others. The fact that we debate about what these rights are isn't, it seems to me, a sign of a weakness or irrelevance, but of a willingness of more and more people and states to address a whole range of new and old ethical issues. So I don't want to argue that human rights frees us of politics, but rather it encourages new forms, both nationally and internationally, of political action. So my answer to the claim that my colleague Alex Cook made, whenever someone talks about universal rights, he thinks he turns to the particular. I certainly take the point. But as I'll try to show you the ending, I think that the actual payoff is where the universal deals with the particular. It matters that it be universal as well as that it matters that it be at a particular place. And I'll return to that at the end. So let me just briefly talk about what I didn't talk about. Some of this stuff has come up to me in our conversations at coffee, where people ask me questions that I realized I just didn't know about it, or I hadn't studied it, or lectures I give in the future. So when I do this course again, there are three things I think I'd like to talk about more in some detail. One is the human rights in corporations. There's a whole world of organizations which try to make corporations adhere to certain human rights standards. The Nike boycott is the most famous. If you read the New York Times today, you'll see that the Witness, a important human rights organization, has just backed out of supporting the International Diamond Agreement, in which diamonds were supposed to have been certified as not having been produced by slave labor or in support of civil wars. I don't know very much about this story, but if I were going to do this course again in a different way, I think I would talk more about the issue of political pressure on corporations to deal with issues of human rights violations and environmental violations, which are part of the story, which we learned about in the last lecture. And we talked about that human rights, that Amnesty is very much interested in keeping large companies, in this case Royal Dutch Shell, from destroying the environment in Nigeria. So those are a whole set of issues that we haven't even touched upon. The other thing I think I'd like to do more about and learn more about myself is conflicts over rights within national communities. And it seems to be every time we pick up the newspapers, we read about another debate, not between the West and the rest, or but in local communities. I'd like to know a lot more about the politics of women's claims for rights in Saudi Arabia. just to give you one example, I'd like to know more about who in China has these different views on what constitutes of what's important, an individual political right or an economic right. So there's a way in which I think I'd like to do more national histories than I did in the course of this time. And the last thing I think that seems to me really important is that we start thinking about the issue of human rights violations in civil war contexts in which both sides do horrible things and neither can be declared to be the victim. In other words, so much of human rights discourse is that someone is doing something horrible to someone innocent. It could be, and usually it's a state doing something horrible to someone innocent, but it need not be the state. But some of the worst human rights violations right now are occurring within civil war context. So we are perfectly willing to bring to justice the dictators of various African countries who do terrible things, and we're able to do that. But we're not. No one speaks about bringing to justice both sides of the civil war in Iraq, of horrible bombings and terrible things between Shiite and Sunni groups. Or in the Congo even. We hear a lot about Darfur where the state is doing it. We don't hear very much about the Congo. Why? Because we do, as we did in the case of former Yugoslavia, say, these are ancient ethnic hatreds, there's nothing we can do about it. So in some sense, I think I'd like to talk more and think more about the question of international or both states and civil society engaging with these contexts in which it's not clear that there's a victim and a victimizer that's evenly divided, but in which, and Iraq is one good example in which, well, the three, there's what we did and there's what they do to each other. The American case is a state doing it. That's sort of traditional that we can have views on. But the other is not traditional states doing it. It's people doing it in a civil war context. But that doesn't mean it's not horrible and violates these standards that we've been talking about. So I think if I did the courts again, I would try to speak more about those kinds of this kind of disputes than just things that engage the state. So I'd add corporations, I'd do more things within national communities, and I would try to look at this at intra-civil conflict. Okay, this is my last thought before coffee, and at the end of the course. So what I tried to do in the course so far then is to locate the particularity of universal claims in specific places. So we have universal claims on the one hand, so we began the course, and every lecture almost I tried to give you a particular example of those, a particular case where the universal meets the particular. So it claims in specific places, in times, events, and campaigns, and in people. But I haven't taken that, I want you to notice I haven't taken that as an effort to constitute a critique of human rights. Some of you may have been critical of my not being critical enough of human rights discourse. But what I wanted to show you is not that the fact that there are all these particular variations and denials and hypocrisies is a critique against this notion of these universal claims. Rather, I've tried to take the course as an argument for why the meaning of these universal claims is not self-evident. In other words, no universal claim it's always at the particularity. It's not self-evident. And that the implementation of these claims is not an apolitical act, as Sam Moynihan argued, a utopian act, but a political act, an act of political involvement. So the claim, at its most grand, the action is where the cosmic meets the particular.